Hi everyone, welcome back. We're now in the third video. I said at the end of the last video that we want sound arguments, but that there was one more condition that we're looking for. And that's because not all sound arguments are good arguments. So just having a sound argument doesn't necessarily mean you've got a good argument. Because here's a sound argument. The earth is round. Premise one. Therefore, the earth is round. Premise two, or conclusion, I mean. Statement two is the conclusion of the argument. That's a one premise argument. The earth is round, therefore the earth is round. Now that's a sound argument, right? The premise is true, and the conclusion certainly follows from the premise because the conclusion is the premise. Either the earth is round, in which case the premise and conclusion are both true, or the earth is not round, in which case neither the premise nor conclusion is true. And in both of those cases, you do not have a true premise with a false conclusion. So this argument is valid with a true premise. So it's a sound argument. But if you find yourself in a discussion with a flat earther about whether or not the earth is round, this sound argument will not convince them. This sound argument will not help anybody get to the truth. This will not help anyone find out what's true or get a new answer to the question. And the reason for that is that no one would accept the premise of this argument unless they had already accepted the conclusion. And so the argument can't be used the way we want arguments to be used. It can't be used to get you to a new true belief. This argument is sound. The premise is true and the argument is valid. But it's still not going to help anybody make progress. Karl Popper, in the quote we looked at in the first video, said that the purpose of an argument is progress. It's not victory, it's progress. And this argument cannot help anyone make progress towards true belief. And that's because the argument is what's called circular. It's just a circle. The conclusion and the premise are sort of a closed loop. You can't believe the premise unless you already believe the conclusion. You won't believe the conclusion unless you believe the premise. It's this closed loop, and there's no way in. If you don't already believe the premise, if you don't already believe the conclusion, then this argument does nothing for you. So there's something wrong with the argument. The argument begs the question. This is another way of saying circular. It begs the question. The conclusion's already one of the premises. It's its only premise. And that means that the argument is not persuasive. Persuasive in the sense that it could be used to persuade someone that the conclusion is true. This argument isn't persuasive in the sense that no one will accept the premise of the argument unless they already accept the conclusion. And what we really want are arguments that are persuasive. Persuasive in the sense that they could be used, at least in theory, to persuade someone. Because that means that the argument could, at least in theory, move someone from not having a true belief to having a true belief, not believing the conclusion to believing the conclusion. And that's what we want. We want arguments. Often in philosophy, we're looking for arguments in order to persuade ourselves because we don't know the answer to the question and we want to find out the right answer. So we look for arguments that will persuade us that one answer is true, and then we'll know the right answer, hopefully, if all goes well. We want arguments that will persuade, maybe us, maybe others, but someone, in theory. It could be used to persuade someone. And in order for an argument to persuade someone, either yourself or someone else, that the conclusion is true, you have to accept the premises already and then follow the steps of the argument to the conclusion. And so you have to accept the premises and then be convinced on the basis of those premises that the conclusion must be true. That's what a good argument does. It starts with premises you accept and then makes a bunch of inferences, makes a bunch of steps, leading you to the conclusion that follows from those premises. And then you can see, okay, this conclusion must be true. And you're persuaded by the argument that the conclusion is true. And so in philosophy, we don't just want sound arguments. We don't just want arguments with true premises and true conclusions, because they might be circular. They might beg the question. Instead, we want persuasive sound arguments. Persuasive sound arguments. We want arguments that are persuasive in the sense that you could, in theory, accept the premises without already accepting the conclusion, so that the argument could lead you from accepting the premises but not accepting the conclusion to now accepting the conclusion and now realizing the conclusion must be true. So we want persuasive arguments. And in order for an argument to be persuasive, we have to be able to accept the premises without already accepting the conclusion. So if we don't believe that the premises are true, then the argument won't persuade us to accept the conclusion. And so if you can only accept the premises of the argument after already accepting the conclusion, then the argument can't be used to persuade you. So here are two arguments, and these are taken from Jim Pryor's website in the reading that I sent out for this week. Either God exists or 2 + 2 = 5. 2 + 2 does not equal 5, and therefore God exists. That's one argument. Here's another. Either God does not exist or 2 + 2 = 5. 2 + 2 does not equal 5, therefore God does not exist. Right? These are two different arguments. And both of these arguments are valid. If the premises are true, the conclusion would have to be true. Suppose that either God exists or 2 + 2 = 5. Suppose that's true. Well, since 2 + 2 does not equal 5, the only option left is that God exists. And suppose that either God does not exist or 2 + 2 = 5. Well, if those are the only two options, and we know 2 + 2 does not equal 5, then the only option left is that God does not exist. So both of these arguments are valid. And one of these arguments is sound. Because if God really exists, then the premise, either God exists or 2 + 2 = 5, is true. Right? If you say, I either left my keys in the house or I left my keys in the car, and your keys were actually left in the house, then what you said was true. Either I left my keys in the house or I left my keys in the car. If you make an or statement like that, as long as one side, the thing on one side of the or is true, then your claim was true. Either God exists or 2 + 2 = 5. If God exists, then that is true. It's true that either God exists or 2 + 2 = 5. It's still a weird thing to say, but it's true, regardless of how weird it is to say that sentence out loud just in conversation. So if God exists, then the argument on the left here is sound. If God does not exist, then the argument on the right here is sound. So one of these arguments is sound. But who knows which one? If you don't already have a belief one way or the other about whether or not God exists, then neither of these arguments could possibly persuade you. The only way to believe premise one of either argument is to already believe the claim about whether or not God exists. The only way you accept premise one of the argument on the left is that you believe God exists, meaning you already believe the conclusion. So the only person who accepts both premise 1 and premise 2, already accepts the conclusion. And that means the argument can't be used to persuade anybody. You can't accept the premises unless you've already accepted the conclusion. And so these arguments aren't persuasive. These are not good arguments. These are not what we're looking for. If I ask you to give me a sound argument proving whether or not God exists, and you give me both of these and say one of these must be right, you haven't helped me. Yeah, that just doesn't help anybody. So we don't want arguments like this. We don't want arguments that only preach to the choir, that only show that the conclusion is true to people who already believe it's true. We don't just want to preach to the choir. We want arguments that can persuade someone who hasn't already accepted the conclusion, persuade them that the conclusion must be true. And so that's what we want from persuasive arguments. So both of these arguments are sound, or one of these arguments is sound, but whichever one it is not persuasive. So what we're looking for in philosophy are persuasive sound arguments. We want arguments that are valid, arguments that have true premises, and arguments that have premises we accept, or at least premises that one could accept without accepting the conclusion. And those are the kinds of arguments we want in philosophy, and those are the kinds of arguments we're going to look for this semester. So that's all I wanted to talk about this week. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I will try to be as helpful as possible. Otherwise, I will see you in the videos next week.